Hello and welcome back to a new look wine school, and we're starting off in the old world today with Bordeaux. One thing I would say with any wines really is they do need a little bit of time to breathe, but it's more important in Bordeaux than any other region. If you haven't done that, you can just double decant it, just pour it into a jug, pour it back into the bottle, get some air into it and help it breathe. If you haven't, then taste along with the wines and then maybe go back to them in an hour's time and see if they've changed at all. I think that you'll find they will, because that just opens up the bouquet a little bit. Gives them a little bit more breadth and depth. Winemaking in Bordeaux started in Roman Gaul, but we're going to start looking at a brief history of it with Britain or England's long association with Bordeaux, with the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry Plantagenet in 1152. This was really the start of this long association with Britain. Our term claret, I think, exemplifies the wine best when we come to that. It was really Henry's son, Richard the Lionheart, who favoured the wines of Bordeaux, although as he spent a lot of his time in the Holy Land crusading, he didn't really do much to encourage the trade in the UK. But it was the start of a long association with Bordeaux wines being found in the cellars of English royalty and Scottish royalty later on as well. Bordeaux's rival port to the north, La Rochelle, stayed loyal to the French side during the struggles between the English and the French, and Bordeaux usually stayed loyal to the British. Which is why the British favoured it. But because the port of Bordeaux had so much power, even when it was back under French rule, they actually managed to keep exporting to the UK. The merchants indeed had such power that they actually essentially blockaded the development of wines from the rest of the southwest, such as Périgord and Cahors. That's why even to this day the wines aren't as well known as those from Bordeaux, or as developed historically. Up until the 17th century, the wines of Bordeaux were just generic Bordeaux, claret, whatever you might call it. But it was a mention in Pepys's diary, Samuel Pepys, of a particular wine which he referred to as Haut-Brion, but which historical records tally as being Chateau Haut-Brion. And this is one of the first mentions of an actual chateau or estate wine, rather than just generic wine from the region. And a lot of these estates were developed, particularly in the 17th century, by the nobles. It was a bit of a playground. And it was as much perhaps because of their money and their ability to make the best wine they could, rather than having to make volume for the market, that helped develop Bordeaux into the quality wine it is today. They could restrict yields, they could do quite stringent experimental vineyard practices to get the best wine, rather than simply relying on having to make as much money as they could because of the unfair taxation at the time. They already had enough money. They could simply focus on the quality of the wine. Looking at a map of Bordeaux, you can see that it's divided in two by the broad estuary of the Gironde River, and this is fed into by the Garonne and the Dordogne. The area between them is known as Entre DeMer, which is where a lot of wine historically was produced before the northern left and right banks were developed to the extent they are today. In fact, Bordeaux is still referred to in generic terms as left bank and right bank, the left bank being most of the famous estates in the 1855 classification, which we'll come on to in a minute, and the right bank you'd know best. The best areas you would know would be Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. There is, however, a lot more to Bordeaux than just the generic areas we're looking at today. Up until recently, Bordeaux actually produced more wine than the whole of Australia, so it's much more nuanced than we have time to look at today. I'm just trying to give you a broad overview of the area. The climate in Bordeaux is maritime, being quite close to the Atlantic, quite moderate. Between the Atlantic and Bordeaux, there's a large forest, the Landes forest, which moderates a lot of the worst effects of the Atlantic coming in from the west, and also helps keep the climate much more even than it otherwise would be. For red wines, the predominant grape varieties are Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. You also see a little bit of Malbec, Petit Verdot and Cabernet Franc in the blend, sometimes to a greater or lesser extent, but it's really Cabernet and Merlot that dominate here. Broadly speaking, the left bank is dominated by soils that are based on free draining gravel, and on the right bank it is predominantly clay. It's not hard and fast, it's like everywhere, it's a patchwork of different soil types, but broadly speaking this defines the left and the right bank. Now, Cabernet is the predominant grape on the left bank because it prefers free draining soil. Gravel soils tend to warm up much more quickly in the spring, and Cabernet ripens relatively early. Merlot, on the other hand, flowers up to 2 weeks later than Cabernet, and coincidentally, clay soils actually take about 2 weeks longer to warm up than the gravel soils in the other parts of Bordeaux. So this is why those grape varieties predominate in these areas. Trial and error over the years has found the best sites and the best grapes planted. However, you do find lots of Cabernet on the right bank, lots of Merlot on the left, and all the other grape varieties as well, because Bordeaux, above anything, is usually a blend rather than one single variety, with a few exceptions. At its most basic level, Bordeaux has three classifications: Cremant de Bordeaux, which is the sparkling wine, Bordeaux and Bordeaux Superior. There is additionally Cru Bourgeois Superior, and Cru Bourgeois Exceptionnel. I don't want to dwell too much on this classification. It's worth seeking out if something says Cru Bourgeois on it, because it does have a classification that sits between Bordeaux Superior and the class growths of the Médoc and Pomerol and Saint-Emilion. The left bank of Bordeaux is known as the Médoc, also, the Haute Médoc, the central part nearest to the river. And you've got Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, Saint-Julien and Margaux, and then south of Bordeaux itself. It was a classification put together for an exhibition, which is just one of many classifications. Just this one seems to have stayed the course over the years. The 1855 classification has become codified in the appellation system in Bordeaux. At the top of the Haute Médoc, we have our first wine today, Château Patache d'Eau. This is 60% Cabernet, the rest being made up of Merlot, Petit Verdot and Malbec. Now it's got the typical Bordeaux colour, sort of medium colour, a garnet. It's got a little bit of age to it. This is 2016. On the nose you've got plenty of fruit there, but there's also a lovely savoury character, a little bit of bramble, some leaf mould that's very typical of Bordeaux. On the palate you've got the fruit again, that lovely cassis character, a little bit of tobacco coming through. The overwhelming impression though is dryness. It's not to say there's not fruit there, but if you compare this to, say, a Chilean Cabernet Sauvignon with that more voluptuous fruit, this is very much a wine of its place. A great food wine. This would be lovely with ribeye steak or any hard cheese like cheddar or Comté. It's really a food wine. One of the other things I like about these wines, whether it's a reasonably modestly priced wine like this or the class growth, is that all have a clarity to them, and that's why I like the old French medieval English word claret or claret, where our modern term for Bordeaux wines, claret, comes from, referred to a much lighter wine. Not quite a rosé, but they tended to be much lighter when they first come into the UK. But I still think the wines have a clarity, which is why the name suits them so much. On the right bank, the two names that you probably know best are Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. Now, Saint-Emilion was formally classified in the 1950s, and it's much more flexible than the classification of the wines of the left bank and the Médoc. In that wines can be elevated or demoted if they don't meet the criteria over various sort of panel tastings and judgments. So Saint-Emilion Grand Cru has perhaps more meaning and, for me, more credibility than some of the classifications of the left bank. Pomerol's never really been formally classified in the same way as Saint-Emilion and other wines, which is ironic given that it's home to two of the most expensive wines in the world. One of them is Château Petrus, is on average about £3,000 or £4,000 a bottle. It's a great wine, but what it basically comes down to is the production there is only about 2,000 cases a year, so its desirability pulls the price way above its intrinsic quality. Lovely though it is, you know, that kind of price is simply an effect of inflation and desirability and lack of volume. And interestingly, although the Chateaux of Bordeaux are associated with the nobility, many of them don't actually have a chateau at all. And the next one we've got here is from Saint-Emilion, Saint-Emilion Grand Cru. The same vintage as Patache d'Eau we've just had, just so we're doing a reasonably fair comparison. They're roughly the same price as well. So you're just getting all other factors being taken out, you're getting a comparison of the left and the right, the main differences between the two styles. This is 100% Merlot. It's made by Denis Durantou of Château l'Église Clinay in Pomerol, a very prestigious estate. And what you're getting here is what you find actually across Bordeaux is some of the producers of some of the top wines, names like Moyeux family, there's quite a few of those, who own Petrus. Bernard Magrez, where they own and buy up some of these smaller, less well-known chateaux. The investment they put into it and the attention to detail means that you can get wines that punch well above their weight. So sometimes these names are worth looking out for on the labels. Once you get to know them and you explore Bordeaux a bit more for yourselves and learn a bit more about it, you get all these little nuances and bits of interest. Now this wine, similar sort of colour. There's obviously going to be a family resemblance between them, although this is 100% Merlot. Already on the nose there's much more voluptuousness of fruit, it smells slightly riper. And again, There is a family resemblance, but you get much more ripeness on this, much more voluptuous fruit. Merlot's often seen as a much more accessible grape than Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet can be quite angular, quite grippy with its tannins. Merlot's much softer and more approachable, particularly in its youth. This would work well with cheese and ribeye steak, but actually I think this is more of a wine for duck. Something like pan-fried duck, that kind of thing, would work really well with this wine. It's also useful to go back and taste the wine side by side rather than just individually. Go back and taste the Haut Médoc and then come back to the Merlot again and just see what you feel the differences are and identify it for yourselves. Around Saint-Emilion there's the satellite appellation, the Saint-Georges, Lussac and so on, and there's lots of other sort of little areas around here that, although they may not have quite the most prime sites of the heart of Pomerol and the Saint-Emilion Plateau, they're worth looking at. Lalande de Pomerol, Fronsac, Canon Fronsac, Côte de Castillon, they're all sources of some really good wine. Further south in the Entre DeMer, this is a source of some really good generic Bordeaux as well, some of it fantastic. There's some really well regarded chateaux in here. It's also perhaps better known for its white wines and its sweet wines, notably Cadillac and Lupiac. And as we sort of head further down towards the Garonne River, the other side of it, we come to the great sweet wine areas of Sauterne and Barsac. This area, Sauterne in particular, benefits in a slightly different way from the maritime climate. You've got a lovely long ripening period. The grapes here are Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon and Muscadel, which are blended in varying proportions. It tends to be predominantly Semillon, then Sauvignon Blanc and a little bit of Muscadel, depending on the blend. The most important thing here, though, is the confluence of the Ciron River with the Garonne. And the Ciron comes from a spring, so it's really cold, and the temperature difference when it hits the Garonne causes overnight mists to form more reliably here than in many other parts of Bordeaux. And this encourages a rot to develop on the grapes. Now, you might not think this is a particularly good thing, but Botrytis cinera is also known as noble rot. And what it does is it pierces the grape skins, because Semillon and Sauvignon in particular have quite thin skins, and it draws out the water, but nothing else. So it leaves behind all the sugars, all the flavourings in the grape, and a certain amount of the acidity as well, so it's all in balance. And what this gives you when it's pressed and vinified is a lovely golden sweet wine. If we try the next wine, the Sauterne. You can see, compared to a standard white wine, the depth of colour in here. That's mainly from just the concentration of all the matter in the grapes when they're pressed. Even though it's been filtered and fined, it still retains a lot of the colour. It's a lovely smell of apricots. It's very typical of Sauterne and a lot of sweet wines that are made in this way. One thing that's worth mentioning also is that nobly rotted grapes actually lose some of their varietal character. So you do get a lot of fruit flavours coming through, but it doesn't taste specifically of Sauvignon Blanc or Semillon. It's more about the components of the grape. So it's lusciously sweet, a really gorgeous wine, but not cloyingly so. There's about 200 grams per litre of sugar in here, which is really high. If you just put that amount of sugar into water of the same proportions, it would be sickeningly sweet, whereas the acidity here just holds everything together really beautifully. This is a lovely dessert wine, particularly with fruit desserts. Classic match, of course, is pâté. Works really well with any number of savoury foods, but pâté in particular. It's a really lovely example of the wine. And given the amount of work that goes into this and the yields, going around a standard Sauterne, you get a quarter to a sixth of the amount of wine in the bottle that you would for the equivalent red wine. Some estates even hand-pick individual berries, do several passes over several days to get them the absolute perfect level of shriveledness to press them to make their wine, which all goes to explain why it is the price it is, but it's also just a superb wine. Even though it's world famous, I still think it's quite underrated compared to the red wines of the region. Anyway, I hope this little taster of these three wines has encouraged you to explore the region a little more. There's a lot of snobbery around Bordeaux, and a lot of the prices I've mentioned can be absolutely astronomically sky high. Between £10 to £30, I think we've got some of the best wines available on the market from Bordeaux. They're really versatile, they go with any number of foods. They're savoury as well. I find they're not too overblown. I can drink perhaps a little more of this than I could in Aussie Shiraz, which I think, lovely though they can be, they're a little bit too chewy to have too much of. They're just perfect for, you know, enjoying a bottle over a meal over the course of an evening. And given their world-class status, I still think they're underrated in the UK. Thank you for joining us this week, and we'll see you next time for another part of France.